Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is David Willis, and I work for the BBC, as you do if you have an outrageous accent like this. And we have to talk about technology and the economy. Two fabulous experts on the subject, Dr. Ira Kalish and John Hagel III, respectively economists and technologists. Would that be fair to say, gentlemen?
Yes.
More or less. Ira, what is the impact of the technological revolution on the economy?
Well, technology has always been the principal driver of economic growth from the earliest days. In the long term, the only way we actually increase our standard of living is through technological innovation, not by adding more workers or adding more capital to workers. So there's nothing new about that. What is new is that the information technology revolution of the past 30 years did have a significant impact on economic growth, accelerated our ability to grow without inflation, and that combined with globalization was one of the driving forces of what's happened in our world and has enabled us to substantially increase living standards not only in rich countries like the US but around the world. And that will continue. It won't just be IT, it will be bioscience, but whatever it is, that is what will drive us to the next step.
The point has been made in the past that this has been one of those revolutions that actually hasn't created jobs, unlike a technological revolution that brought about the car, for example, the automobile. You know, companies like Facebook have, 2,000 employees and so on. Where's the advantage?
Well, technological revolutions usually initially destroy jobs because they make us more productive. They enable us to do things cheaper and more quickly and with fewer people. But in the course of doing that, they free up resources to do other things. So although IT doesn't really directly
But the motor industry actually created a lot of jobs.
It created a lot of jobs, but, and that increased productivity. But what IT really did was enable us to do a lot of things that we weren't able to do before. Look at a company like Walmart, which used information technology to revolutionize the supply chain, to enable them to deliver goods more cheaply, more quickly, with fewer workers. That made goods cheaper. That made it possible for people to buy more stuff. That freed up resources so that people could buy more things that they weren't able to buy before. And
if they had a job, of course.
Well, if they had a job. But I mean, most of the time, most people have jobs. We're in a lull right now, but that will end. But the role of technology is not necessarily to directly create jobs, although it does have that effect. The larger role is to reduce costs, to enable us to do things we didn't do before. The automobile enabled us to travel in a way we didn't before. We didn't need as many horses and as many people who made horseshoes. So it actually destroyed a lot of jobs. And that's the nature of technology. But in the long run, it does enhance our standard of living.
John Hagel, what's your perspective on this?
Well, I would certainly echo the comments that Ira made in terms of the role of technology in driving economic progress and advancement. I do think that there's another side to technology that particularly those of us who are evangelists about technology tend not to focus on as much, and that is that at the same time that it's creating growing opportunity, it's also creating mounting pressure on all of us. And it's a pressure, and I'm in particular referring to digital technology at this point, the infrastructures that have emerged around it. What it's doing is enhancing connectivity on a global scale in ways that, from an economic viewpoint, reduce barriers to entry and barriers to movement. So competitive pressure intensifies. Mark last night talked about economic cyber war, and that's certainly one manifestation of these digital infrastructures, the ability to penetrate and access in knowledge and IP in ways that weren't feasible before. But even more broadly, it's just the notion that we are under increasing pressure in our businesses. Now, from a customer viewpoint, that's great. I mean, to Ira's point earlier, it means that we're basically getting much more value at lower cost. But if we're in a business, if we're trying to earn a return to shareholders, the analysis we've done shows that over the past 40 years in the United States, return on assets has declined by 75% for all public companies, 75% erosion in profitability. And topple rates, the rate at which companies fall out of leadership positions, whether you look at it in terms of the top quartile of profitability or participation on the S&P 500, the topple rates are increasing at a dramatic rate. If you made it onto the S&P 500 in 1937 at the height of the Depression, you were on that on average for 75 years. If you get onto the S&P 500 today, the leading companies in the United States, your average lifetime is 15 years. There's been an 80% reduction in average lifetime over this time period.
It's an interesting point. I'd be keen to hear what you have to say about that particularly the reduction in profitability.
Well, that's true. I mean, one of the things that the information technology revolution has enabled is what I call commoditization. Because information is so readily available and change can happen so quickly, it makes everything a commodity. It means, and I spend a lot of time looking at the consumer goods and retailing industries. In that industry, what we've seen is, with the proliferation of information, consumers can go online and find out everything they need to know about the products they buy, the pricing, and decide where and when to buy things, mainly on the basis of price, assuming that the quality is the same. That makes everything a commodity. That drives down prices and margins. And then the challenge for the business world is to offset that through brand development, through differentiation, through technological innovation. If you look at a company like Apple, what they've been able to do is avoid that commoditization by continually innovating and developing new products. And hopefully they'll continue to be able to do that. But if they can't, ultimately those products become commodities. The margins go down, the profitability goes down, and the turmoil and turnover in the industry accelerates.
John, talking about turmoil, you also have some thoughts, I believe, about the proliferation of information.
Right. I'm worried about being cast as a techno-pessimist here because I come from Silicon Valley and I'm intrinsically an optimist, but I think there are dimensions of the technology deployment that don't get enough attention. And one of them is the notion that, and again I'm talking primarily about digital technology, is it enhances connectivity. It decreases the lag time in terms of information flows around the world. And if you combine that, so you've got more and more tightly integrated global economic systems, and combine that with this notion of intensifying competition, so there's more friction within this more connected world, that's a formula, if you know anything about complex adaptive systems, that's a formula for cascades of disruption, for these extreme events that Taleb talked about in the form of black swans that become more and more frequent because the most minor perturbation, because of this connectivity, can cascade in ways that quickly go out of control. And so I think one of the interesting design issues is how do we build in more loose coupling into these global connectivity systems so that we can start to create some ways to step back and reflect on what's going on before the thing cascades out of control.
Is there an extent to which just too much twittering, perhaps, can actually create alarm?
Well, I don't want to put all the blame on Twitter. For sure, I think the notion of a whole variety, everything from automated trading systems and positioning your trading servers as close physically to the trading floor as possible because every millisecond of lag time counts. It's those kinds of connectivity that I think are really the most significant contributors to this kind of cascade that can go on.
It was inevitable, though, wasn't it? All of this, it was going to happen sooner or later. It would just, the pace would just increase. If it doesn't happen now, it would happen at some stage. So I suppose we just have to embrace it and find ways around it, don't we?
Well, the problem is that the technology enables us to make more rapid decisions, to do things more quickly than before, but our human nature hasn't changed. And so we have irrational participants in the financial markets who engage in herd behavior, and the technology enables them to do it much more quickly and much more cheaply than was the case in the past. And that has led more recently to more financial volatility. And that maybe speaks to the need for more supervision of markets and more ways of slowing things down and taking a deep breath, if you will.
There has been discussion about China eating our lunch. What's your view on that, Ira?
Well, I'd have to respectfully disagree with what Mark said. I mean, I agree that, yes, in China, on the part of the government, the military, state enterprises, there's a serious concerted effort to steal IP. And this is nothing new. The United States developed its textile industry by stealing IP from England 200 years ago. So there's a precedent for this.
Disgraceful.
And I apologize for that now.
The lawsuits are...
I accept your apology.
Okay. But in the long run, that's really not what drives an economy. And China's growth has largely been because they've been able to move people from farms into factories, dramatically increasing their productivity. And to the extent that there's been significant productivity gains in China, it's mostly been due to the investments made by foreign companies, not the Chinese companies. China has some substantial imbalances in its economy, which could lead to much slower growth in the near future. For one thing, they invest far too much in useless things. Ordinarily, countries invest in order to develop the capacity to produce more things in the future. So you put off consumption today so you can consume more in the future. And normally, countries invest 20 to 30% of GDP, and they get a positive return on that. Right now in China, investment is 50% of GDP, and they're not getting the kind of return they need. Countries that grew in the past as fast as China has, like Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, invested much less. And yet China has invested so much and not grown as fast as those countries did during their takeoff phase. So it's a very inefficient investment. They're investing not so much to get a return, but to make work, to keep people employed. They're building apartment complexes, shopping centers, high-speed rail that no one's using. The largest mall in the world, the South China Mall in Dongguan, 7 million square feet of selling space, is 98% empty. They can't lease the space. That's a completely useless investment. And as China continues to do that, ultimately that's not going to be sustainable. The other challenge they face is demographic. Their labor force growth is slowing. The migration from the farms is slowing. And unless they're able to accelerate their productivity growth, their economy will grow more slowly in the next decade, probably more slowly than India. So I'm actually somewhat pessimistic about China, and I don't think they're eating our lunch. They're a very poor country. We're a much richer country, and we're much better at generating innovation than they are. So I'm not as pessimistic as what we heard last night.
John, what about you as far as China is concerned?
Well, I think that I would not be complacent about China on any level. I do think that they have extraordinary ambition. I do think the kinds of things that Mark talked about last night are critical to understanding competitive advantage on a global scale. Though we've spent a lot of time, I run a research center, and we've spent a lot of time with research teams in China. And one of the things that we focused on is there are many Chinas. There's the state-owned enterprise sector, there's the rural sector, there's urban sectors where there's more entrepreneurial activity. One of the things in the entrepreneurial side of China is a set of companies that are developing what I would describe as institutional innovation, ways of creating scalable global networks and coordinating complex processes on a global scale, much more loosely coupled, much more flexible than U.S. management techniques that are huge engines for growth. And to the extent there is growth in China, I would say a key part of that is this entrepreneurial sector, which is driving in industries from apparel to motorcycles to consumer electronics, a set of practices and institutional arrangements that allow companies to scale much more rapidly and access specialized talent much more effectively.
What about technology as a motor for the economy? Going back to that point, you know, companies like Facebook, well, Facebook employs, what, 2,000 people? I think Google maybe 20,000. But these are not significant employers, are they? What's your view about technology, IT, and its contribution to the economy, and particularly getting us out of this economic slump?
Well, I'm an optimist at the end of the day. I think that there are a set of technologies coming together today that are extraordinarily powerful and will be engines for economic growth. If you think about the combination of cloud computing, providing access to extraordinarily sophisticated technology wherever you are, social networks that help connect us in ways that we've never been able to do before, in more scalable ways, mobile technology, and then a fourth pillar is this whole notion of big data analysis. How do you take terabytes of data and identify patterns in them in ways that you just couldn't before? The combination of those four, I think, particularly for the more entrepreneurial side of the U.S. economy, the small business side, provide a platform for small businesses to scale in ways that were never possible before, and even start businesses that were never possible before. I mean, there are startups in Silicon Valley that are accessing extraordinarily sophisticated electron microscopes to do their research. As a startup, you could have never done that. You know, now you can do that. It's a simple task. So I think that there's a tremendous engine for further growth. But again, on the flip side, I think the implication of that is that for large established companies, it creates a huge challenge because companies can come out of nowhere and scale in ways that were never feasible before.
Also, Ira, the whole question about the jobs that are being created, presumably not only are there not that many, it could be argued, but also they are specialist types of jobs, yes, which are paying quite good wages, right, and presumably accelerating the gap in earnings.
Absolutely. One of the things we've seen in the past 30 years is a tremendous widening in the gap in income distribution. And it has had a lot to do with a supply-demand imbalance. Up until the 1970s, we were very substantially increasing the average level of education of the American population. Somebody who was born in, say, 1950, on average, had 2 more years of education than their parents. Yet someone born today has only 9 months more education than their parents' generation, on average. That means we've decelerated the development of skills, just at the same time when our need for skills has accelerated. What the information technology revolution, as well as globalization, did was expand the demand for highly skilled workers. It expanded the productivity of those workers. It reduced the demand for unskilled workers and didn't really push their productivity. So the end result was big increase in the wages of the highly skilled, the more affluent people, and downward pressure on the wages of everyone else. And so in the past 30 years, 60% of all the personal income growth in the United States accrued to the top 1% of all people. And what we're now seeing is, going forward, it's mostly affluent people who are going to see income gains in the coming decade, while lower to middle income people won't see any substantial income gains. And in the past decade, we were able to get around that because people took on debt against the value of their homes. But we can't do that anymore. So we're going to see, I think, more social tension in this country as a result of that widening gap that's been caused by investment in IT and, at the same time, a failure to develop more skilled people. The solution is better education and perhaps more immigration of skilled people. It was mentioned last night, when people come here to go to the university, they should staple a green card. I think that's a very good idea.
I'd like to, sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to add, though, I think building on this, that the trends that I was talking about are front and center and a potential source of friction and instability. Again, I want to flip it around in terms of the potential for information technology. And I think one of the biggest areas that has not been addressed by IT in any systematic way is how do you, if you took talent development seriously, how would you redesign the workplace to become a learning place where talent development occurs on the job? You don't have to go off to a training program somewhere for a week and then come back into your job. You're learning on a day-to-day basis in the job. One of the interesting early examples of this kind of application is a company called LiveOps, a startup here in the United States, which focused on call center operations without a call center. So what they've done is basically they've created an technology infrastructure that connects people, particularly people who have to work from home. And often women who are raising families don't want to go into a call center for a period of time. but want a job, and create a way for them to connect in virtually, create a virtual call center. But the most important aspect of this startup, I think, is the focus that they have had on talent development. Of every one, they now have 20,000 employees, contractors, and their focus is relentlessly on how do we take these people who've never had any experience in call center operations and rapidly develop their talent on a continuing basis. It's not just get them to a certain level and then stop. It's day by day, how do we get them to increase their performance? The kinds of feedback mechanisms they've put in place with technology so you can get real-time benchmarking of your performance, the kinds of coaching systems and online discussion forums where you can exchange best practices, all of those create a very powerful talent development engine. And I think that's a key to resolving a lot of the pressures and issues that Ira's talked about, is take this technology and focus it on talent development. Interesting.
Picking up, actually, on a point that, that John made earlier, Ira, there's a quote here from Professor Paul Krugman, who said that the profits of an information economy seem to have forgotten basic economics. He said this a little while ago, actually. When something becomes abundant, it also becomes cheap, which is in a sense a point that, that John was making. What do you make of that, the sort of proliferation of information and so on?
Well, it has both positive and negative consequences. The positive consequence is it makes everything cheaper. It enhances our living standards. It enables us to do things we didn't do before. But it also has that commoditization impact. So while it's a good thing for consumers, it's not necessarily always a good thing for every company. And it means in the business world, having to be a bit more sharp, having to be a bit more fast-moving, having to be persistently innovative. You can't just stand still. I think what it means is that every successful strategy eventually fails, and maybe fails quickly. And that means if you don't continually innovate and invest in building the brand of your product or service, you're going to lose margin and ultimately lose everything.
And the future for IT with biotech, perhaps?
Well, I'm not a technologist, so I can't predict what technology will rule the day in the future, but I think I can reasonably predict, based on the past, that technological innovation will continue to drive economic growth. And now we're seeing tremendous developments in biotechnology which have implications not just for life sciences but for all types of industries. I think that will be one of the drivers of economic growth. And I think we'll continue to see a lot of that innovation take place in more open societies like the United States. Places like China may try to steal some of that, that's true. But I think more of the innovation will take place here because we have the atmosphere, the capital markets, the free flow of information that enables that to happen. A country like China can invest in massive numbers of scientists and engineers, but at the end of the day, if they don't have the kind of educational system that encourages free thinking, that encourages originality rather than rote memorization, they're not going to be the ones that develop that. So in that sense, the kind of society that you have, the kind of rule of law, the kind of culture that you have, will make a big difference in terms of where that innovation takes place.
John, what do you think?
I just wanted to add one other dimension of the impact of technology on the global economy that is hotly debated, but I have a very strong point of view on, which is this notion that IT, digital infrastructures, basically make location irrelevant. That it no longer matters where you are in the world. You can just plug into this great cyber infrastructure, and it's as if you were anywhere. I actually take an opposite viewpoint, that location is becoming more and more important as digital technology infrastructures play out. The paradox is, how do you explain the movement, the mass global movement of population into urban areas, if location no longer matters? Why is that happening? Even in the most advanced digital infrastructure countries, urbanization is accelerating. I think part of the answer to that is this notion, again, of talent development. I think instinctively we have a sense that no matter how powerful this digital infrastructure is, if we are in a dense urban population where there are a lot of people who share our particular talent interests. We're going to learn faster in that environment than we would in some rural area. I think the whole notion of serendipity, this increasing, in a world of increasing change and uncertainty, you no longer even know who to look for or what to ask for. Your chances of that unexpected encounter with somebody who's working on something quite similar but you never even knew about, and you come away and say, wow, that was so valuable, that was so helpful to me, that's going to occur much more likely in a city than in some farm in Dubuque, Iowa.
So we still need the water cooler, and we...
Right.
Absolutely.
You need collaboration. And it's no accident that we're sitting here in California, that so much of the most innovative stuff that goes on in the world takes place here. Shanghai University every year does a survey where they rank the top universities in the world by various reasonable criteria. They take 500 universities. Of the top 20 in the world, 17 are in the U.S., and 6 of those are in California. And so it's no accident that California is the place that develops so many of the pioneering ideas. And it's not necessarily people who grew up in California. These can be people who came from anywhere in the world. You could have somebody from a poor country like Nigeria or Indonesia, and yet they're not developing those businesses in those countries. But those very same people will come here and develop businesses that revolutionize the world. And it has to do with what kind of atmosphere we've created. The free flow of information, transparent capital markets, liberal attitudes toward social issues. I think that makes a tremendous difference in terms of where things happen. So John is correct. Location matters tremendously.
And rubbing shoulders with other human beings.
Well, that's true. You have to, at the end of the day, you have to have lunch. And you have to interact with other people. It's not sufficient to interact by email and Twitter and telephone. You actually have to look at somebody and see their body language and feel comfortable with them. So there have to be clusters of people. You can't just have an Apple or a Google having developed in a small town in Iowa. It probably wasn't going to happen.
John, just going back to the future as you see it, where is the technological future as far as impacting the economy is concerned?
Well, again, at the end of the day, I'm a huge optimist about where this is all headed. I've been in Silicon Valley for 30 years, so it's in the gene pool at this point. But I think at the highest level, you can think about technology as making smart things smarter, dumb things smarter, and living things much more robust. And all three of those are going to have a dramatic impact on our economic well-being, prosperity. I do come back to this notion of talent development as being the key social, economic, personal priority. All of us, if we're not relentlessly focused on developing our talent as individuals, are going to be increasingly stressed. This is mounting pressure. There is no relief to the pressure. We do have economic cycles that will provide some modest relief, but there is a long-term trend of increasing pressure where we will burn out unless we develop our talents much more rapidly than we ever have in the past.
What sort of talents particularly are you talking about?
Whatever is relevant to your personal desire to have impact and earn enough income to provide for your family. So another theme that we can't get into here is I believe that increasingly we have to integrate passion with our work. If we're not passionate about the work we do, we're not going to develop our talents as rapidly as we need to. A disengaged worker is just not going to develop talent as rapidly as a passionate worker. So this whole notion of how do you connect with a passion, make it your profession. If it's not your profession today, how do you connect those two? And how do you use that as an engine for talent development using technology? I think, again, IT, digital infrastructures, are an incredible platform for talent development if we choose to use them in that way.
And you're a Silicon Valley man. Word has it there aren't actually enough IT professionals out there.
Never enough.
What needs to be done about that?
Well, I think obviously it goes back in part to this notion that Ira was talking about in terms of our educational system, the whole focus on STEM skill cells, science, technology, et cetera, engineering and math, all of those need to be much deeper. I do think this issue of immigration and attracting talent from other parts of the world and giving them opportunity here on a long-term basis is just as critical. I think going out and reaching out to the talent wherever it is also important. I mean, we shouldn't just wait for it all to come here. We need to go out and find it and connect to it in ways that will help us to build our capability much more rapidly.
Gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our time is up. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks.